My name is Neil Fisher, co-owner, co-founder, and head brewer of WeldWerks Brewing Co in Greeley, Colorado. So WeldWerks, we opened in February of 2015, so we are about 2.5 years old. Started by myself and my partner, Colin Jones. We basically started in my garage as homebrewers, so we can relate a lot to homebrewers trying to improve their craft and brew better beer. We started with a kind of informal homebrew group that met in the garage, either to help brew or mostly help drink. Had about 10 or 15 guys, and so that's how Colin and I met within that group. And we would essentially just try and figure out ways to make better beer. And at some point there was this kind of long-standing bet or kind of agreement that if we won medals at some more serious homebrew competitions, we would more seriously pursue opening a brewery. And sure enough, in January of 2014, we started winning a few medals. The first being at the Big Beers Belgians and Barley Wines Festival up in Vail, Colorado. So that year kind of prompted a lot more competitions, a few more medals, national homebrew competition, placed regionally in a few different areas. So after that, Colin was the one that kind of came to me and kind of held my feet to the fire and said, hey, let's see if this has some legs. So we started working on our business plan in March of 2014, and by February of 2015, doors were open and we were serving beer. So kind of a quick from inception to opening for a lot of breweries, but we had been talking about it for a while, so we kind of had an idea of what it would take and what we wanted to accomplish. So now we've been open 2.5 years and kind of on this roller coaster ride of growth, of kind of a lot of interest from not just the Colorado community, but also nationally. We've had our tap room, almost every day we have someone from out of state, someone who's traveling through that's heard about us and wants to try Juicy Bits or one of the stouts we make, or even kettle sours, occasionally Medianoche, our barrel-aged stout. And so since then we've just tried to focus on quality and really investing in our community, driving growth here in Greeley, making a lasting impact here. So we're in a really kind of fun position right now. We're doing a lot of ambitious things. We're taking on new projects. We're taking on a festival next year. We're brewing some pretty exciting styles, including New England style IPAs, and we're kind of just going forward with some innovation that we didn't think was possible when we opened. So we're just really appreciative for all the support. From year one to this year, we're about 1,000% growth, which is just insane. We won't be growing that fast moving forward. We kind of built the brewery with expansion in mind, and we've since filled that space, so we don't have a whole lot of extra room for growth here at WeldWerks. Currently we're working on that, and we're going to be pursuing that, but we're going to be very cautious and a little bit more metered growth, a little bit more planned. We're not going to just let the market demand what we produce and how much we produce. We're going to take a little bit of the Russian River approach of saying this is how much beer we can comfortably make at this point in our business, and just make sure everything's sustainable, make sure we're investing in our people. Our team, we have about 30 people a little over 30 people here working at WeldWerks, and make sure that the right people are in the right positions, investing in them, giving them the opportunities to succeed. We want to make sure we take care of our community, and we want to make sure we make quality beer. So no matter how much more beer we make, we want to make sure that every beer we produce meets our high standard of excellence. So WeldWerks is only available in Colorado. We have a limited distribution footprint, mostly just the Front Range. We do have some cans out in the marketplace, draft as well. Occasionally some of our specialty crowlers will hit a few retail accounts, but that's pretty much just the Front Range of Colorado. So kind of South Denver, all the way up as far north as kind of Fort Collins, Boulder, Loveland, Greeley, and everywhere in between. We haven't quite made it down to Colorado Springs yet, or really out west into the mountain area. Kind of really focused right now on the Front Range, and then the tap room. That's where the majority of our volume goes, whether it's enjoyed here on premise or beer to go, crowlers, 4-packs, bottles. We're doing a lot of releases, usually at least once or twice a month. We're doing something fairly unique. We're doing cans and crowler releases more often than that, usually once a week. So we're just kind of planning on making the tap room our primary outlet for distribution, mainly because we can do some things that we distribute here that we couldn't distribute to an entire footprint. Especially on the IPA side, there's definitely some considerations for shelf stability, how long that beer will be stable when you start distributing it to multiple locations. So moving forward, I'd say for the next 6-12 months, we'll expand our distribution footprint for sure, and we'll distribute more beers, but the primary growth will be here in the tap room. I moved to Colorado about 10 years ago. I grew up in North Carolina. So when I left North Carolina in 2008, the homebrew community was still kind of fledgling a little bit, and really on the verge of some explosive growth that we've seen now. And the same with the craft beer industry there. So I always had an interest in craft beer. There wasn't necessarily the market there yet, and there wasn't the kind of culture of homebrewing and really understanding craft beer to what it is today. But I kind of fostered that growth in college, and then once I moved out to Colorado, took it a little bit more seriously, found homebrew clubs to join, found resources, found basically a group of people that were like-minded and wanted to improve their own brewing, not just make beer. Lots of people can make beer, but making better beer and consistently making good beer is, I think, something that kind of distinguishes your, probably people that are taking these courses from just your average home brewer. So that's, for me, where my passion really grew, was in understanding more about the brewing process and how to make better beer and how to improve each recipe. Started homebrewing in our garage really 5 years before we opened WeldWerks. So spent a lot of time just honing different processes, different recipes, and really just being as inclusive as engaged in the craft beer industry as possible, trying beers from all over the world, just kind of keeping a pulse on what's happening, a finger on the pulse of the craft beer market. So here at WeldWerks, we've kind of taken a different approach to what we produce, how much of it, how we make it. When we first opened, we kind of assumed we had to make the prototypical, stout IPA, red wheat, and that's what we opened with. And now we only have one of those beers still around, our Hefeweizen, which won a silver medal at our first GABF back in 2015. So that beer has stuck around, but after that, we realized that for us, flagships and brewing the same beers, batch after batch, there's some exceptions for sure, Juicy Bits and Hefeweizen being the two most prominent, but we realized that we could kind of use our smaller size to our advantage, and we could be a bit more agile in the marketplace. We could be a bit more nimble. We can adapt to changes in interest, to new processes that are introduced, new hopping techniques, new ingredients that become available. We could be pretty much on the cutting edge of all that because we were not beholden to a set of beers and a set of SKUs that, okay, we make these, however many beers every year. So now we have a lot more flexibility, and we also stopped worrying as much about fitting price points, which the kind of drawback to that is that we do make some beers that are fairly expensive, and we get some negative feedback on that occasionally, which I can certainly understand from the consumer's perspective. When you're used to paying X amount for a beer, and then someone introduces a beer that may be brewed differently with different ingredients, and it costs significantly more, it may be a little bit of a paradigm shift. But for us, we want to make the beers we love, and we want to do that whether it means better ingredients, more of them, different process, and sometimes it just means added cost. And so we kind of, freed ourselves of the burden of having to fit price points for our entire lineup and just make the beers we want. And it really allowed us to be more creative, to focus on styles that may not have made sense, on paper, especially as a growing, packaging distribution brewery. And now we can pretty much do the styles we want. And we're focusing on, New England style IPAs, some hop rates that border on obscene, 12 pounds per barrel, that on paper and financially that's not a very feasible or economically, it's really not a very efficient beer to make. We also do a lot of adjunct stouts, pastry stouts that we kind of use that term endearingly and sometimes at odds as well. But we add coconut, we add cacao, we add vanilla, we add coffee, we add maple syrup, we add all sorts of sometimes expensive ingredients to some of what you would assume would be a more approachable stout, and just take it to the next kind of level of complexity. And then we also do a lot of barrel aging, a lot of barrel aged stouts. We've done some barrel aged sours. Medianoche is a beer we just won a gold medal with at the 2017 GABF for the wooden barrel aged strong beer or strong stout category. It's a category that's, I think, the 4th largest this year, so one of the most competitive. And that's a beer that takes us 17 months this year to produce. So actually longer than that because of fermentation before that. So, it's almost a 19-month beer. By the time you package it and get it out to the market, it's 20 months. So well over a year and a half before that beer is even ready to package and sell. And so that's a beer that's, I think, a perfect example of us, rather than, okay, we have to fit this price point and we have to do it within this time frame. We just let the barrels age as long as they need to. We boil each batch for 10, 12 hours. A lot of people ask us, is that necessary? Scientifically, we haven't proven the impact it has on all. There's Maillard reactions we know have a big impact on mouthfeel and caramelization, but anecdotally, we've done beers that we boil less, and this beer that we boil longer, and this beer produces results that we weren't getting before with longer boils. So those kinds of things, that do they make across the board a better beer? I can't say that it's all definitively that produces that, but we've kind of taken the gloves off a little bit and made whatever styles we want. And fortunately, the market's been fairly supportive of that. With our 15 barrel system, we really don't do a lot of pilot batches or small batch tests. We used to have a 1 barrel pilot system, and unfortunately we just didn't have the time or even the space to utilize it. And so it kind of sat unused for a long time. We finally got rid of it a few months ago, just to make space for some other equipment. But we pretty much brew test batches 15 barrels at a time, which is a little terrifying. It means a lot of the times we're trying to at least learn a little bit about the previous batch that may be similar. If it's a similar style, we can learn a lot from that fermentation, from that process, to improve the next one. But it is a drastically different beer. So it doesn't mean we dump beer. It means that we have such a high standard of quality for ourselves that if a beer doesn't meet that standard, we dump it before the customers ever taste it. Doesn't mean we're not going to experiment. Doesn't mean we're not going to take chances. It also doesn't mean we're not going to put out beer that people may not like. We are going to take a lot of chances. So we will produce beers with a raspberry IPA that some people may love and some people may hate. But that's something we're willing to try it. But our quality standard has always been, no matter what, the beer needs to meet our level of excellence. It needs to be well executed. It needs to be intentional. It can't have obviously any off flavors, anything wrong with it. But beyond that, it has to be interesting. We don't want just pedestrian beer. There's plenty of those beers available, accessible beers. We do make beers that are approachable, but even those styles, we want to have our own unique take on the style. Whether it's a German-American hybrid wheat beer like our Hefeweizen, or if it's a Mexican Vienna lager that brings in both its Austrian heritage and some of the Mexican style components. Or if it's a New England style IPA that now has become a very popular style, but we want to make sure we have our own point of view and our own perspective that adds to the dialogue in the marketplace and adds something unique. So we'll make sure that every beer meets that quality and meets that standard for us, but we are not really testing anything smaller than 15 barrels. So we kind of jump in both feet first. So today we're going to focus a little bit on New England style IPAs. We'll go a little bit past just the basics of the style. We'll cover that briefly. We'll dive more into Juicy Bits and our iteration and our kind of our version of a New England style IPA, how it came to be, the inspiration behind it, developing the recipe. And then we'll also focus a little bit on brewing your own recipe, developing your own New England style IPA recipe, some considerations, things that you can do to make it unique, to make it your own. And then we'll go beyond the IPA, so into New England style pale ales, double IPAs, and even fruited IPAs, because those are very unique. There's some brewing challenges with each of those styles that are unique to the New England style kind of brewing practice. So just quick summary of the style. So New England style IPAs, also known in other markets as Hazy IPAs, which is my least favorite term, but I understand the aesthetic part of that. It's obviously a style that's originated long before we were making any here in Colorado. Obviously the brewers in Vermont and Massachusetts, the Alchemist, Hill Farmstead, Lawson's, now more recently Trillium, Treehouse. Those breweries kind of in the Vermont, Massachusetts area, I think really started this style without being, focused on creating a new style. They were just focused on making the IPAs they wanted to make. They wanted to make something flavorful, something very complex, very flavor driven, and also a little bit more approachable in terms of bitterness and even mouthfeel. There's some balance to a New England style IPA that's unique from its West Coast IPA counterpart. And so I think that just that approach to brewing IPAs, it's a different mindset, created this style, whether it was intentional or not. And now we see that is probably the fastest growing and most popular style currently, especially in 2017 leading into 2018. So what makes a New England style IPA unique? For the entire history of American IPA, it's kind of gone through an evolution. It started really as this East Coast style, more malt forward, using the hops available at the time, which more pine focused, a little grapefruit, but really had a nice malt base to them. That kind of shifted into the West Coast style IPA that we see mostly on shelves now, which focused a little bit less on the malt profile, a little bit more on the hop bitterness, and even started using some newer fruit forward varietals of hops that started coming out in the marketplace. So, but still really dry, really bitter, and a little bit more focused on the bitterness of the beer, but really giving the canvas for the hops to shine. And now New England style IPA has kind of evolved between those two. It's really at its heart, it's a English IPA because of the malt character a little bit, and also because of the yeast and even the bitterness. It has more in common probably with a traditional English IPA in some aspects than it does with a West Coast style IPA. So it basically takes a lot of those traditional West Coast IPA characteristics and inverts them. So high protein malts, that's a big factor. Using wheat or oats or other high protein malts to give a little bit more body and a little bit more mouthfeel instead of just this extremely dry, kind of bone dry finish to it. You have this really soft, pillowy mouthfeel with enough body to kind of support some intense and sometimes almost absurd hop rates. You also have yeast selection as a big factor. So rather than a very clean, very dry, high attenuating, kind of low ester strain, you typically ferment New England style IPAs with more expressive ester-driven, lower attenuating and typically lower flocculating strains, typically English strains. London Ale 3 is a very common example, and also some other derivatives of that and some other styles that or yeasts, dry English, and even Conan, that all seem to have their origins in some of the traditional English IPA strains. So that yeast selection really does have an impact on the rest of the beer. Obviously the fruit character is a big component of that, and that comes from esters, whether it's peach or passion fruit or other stone fruit. There's a lot of ester fruit character in a lot of these New England style IPAs, which really complement the hops fruit character as well. And then the other big component that I think is different from your West Coast style IPA is the water chemistry. West Coast style IPAs usually favor higher sulfates to accentuate bitterness, to give it a bit sharper, kind of even that accentuate the dry finish of the beer. And so you'll see sulfate to chloride ratios at 3-to-1, whereas that's the inverse for most New England style IPAs. You'll see chloride almost double what you're adding for sulfate, sometimes triple. So the water chemistry in particular, you're really focusing on different flavors and different components of the beer. So rather than that bitterness focus, it's a malt focus to give some body. So the last difference that kind of distinguishes West Coast style IPAs and more traditional American IPAs from New England style IPAs is the hops. Whether it's the actual selection, which it's varietals that are fruit forward, a little bit less focus on traditional kind of pine. The traditional C's hops may not be as popular choice versus the newer varietals, Mosaic, Citra, even Amarillo, even the Simcoe that traditionally was used in West Coast style IPAs is seeing a different use in New England style. A little bit more of the fruit character you're pulling out rather than just some of the kind of piney, even more of the grapefruit. You're seeing tropical fruit flavors. You're seeing a lot more new varietals and kind of experimental varietals being utilized, especially in the New England style IPAs. And again, it's the hop rates as well, with a real focus on hop flavor and fruit-forward flavor and hop aroma. But not as much on the bitterness. You're doing hop additions mostly in whirlpool and dry hop. A lot of the IPAs, including our own, have really no kettle additions at all. So we're depending 100% on whirlpool for bitterness, and we're seeing rates of 3 to 4 to 7 to 8 pounds per barrel total, which for a lot of West Coast style IPAs would produce a beer that's almost too bitter and really not balanced. But because of the focus on flavor versus bitterness, there's still balance in those high hop rate New England style IPAs. Also hop techniques, and when you're adding those hops, dry hop especially, a lot of these dry hop additions during fermentation, we're seeing biotransformation happen. So different flavors coming out of the hop additions, especially as they interact with yeast. So adding it at 3 to 4 Plato from terminal is not uncommon, even mid-fermentation additions. And some breweries are even adding them at knockout. So during active fermentation, at the start of fermentation, there's obviously lots of different ways you can accomplish different flavors using the same hops, just depending on when you add them to your beer. And so all those things I think are what distinguish kind of our classic American IPA, which now I think is mostly associated with West Coast style IPAs, with kind of this new take on IPAs and New England style IPAs. So here at WeldWerks, one of our best selling beers is Juicy Bits, and it's probably the beer that most people know WeldWerks for. It's not a beer that we ever planned on making as much as we do now. Essentially was a beer we brewed for our first anniversary. So a little over a year in, or just a year into production, we started to, even back in the fall of 2015, so 7-8 months after we opened, we started really trying to understand more styles that were not available in Colorado. New England style IPA in particular was one that I think Odd 13, Fiction, and Cerebral started brewing before we did, but they were just a few months ahead of ours, and so there really weren't a lot of examples available in our market, and those were all great ones, but we wanted to really dive into the whole style and as it's being brewed across the country. So that fall we really started researching the style, trying to get as many examples of the beer as we could. We tried to really taste every single version of New England style IPA we could, whether it was from the breweries in New England, breweries outside of New England, if it was breweries that, Great Notion, one of our favorites, Bissell Brothers, Tired Hands, Other Half, The Veil now. There's so many great New England style IPA producers across the country outside of New England, and so we really wanted to just understand what was happening beyond just our Colorado market and beyond the specific area where this style I think it originated. So we tasted probably 40 to 50 different beers in that style. They weren't obviously branded New England style IPA or even Hazy IPA. They were just beers we knew kind of had something in common with what we wanted to do. So we weren't trying to clone any of those beers or make those beers exactly. We just wanted to understand what made them unique. The first time we had beers like Julius really challenged the way that we thought about IPA. It was beer that just really, I think, inspired us to learn more about the style. Just the way that the malt character works with the balance of the hops, the mouthfeel, the hop character itself was just better than anything we had in a lot of the beers that we've enjoyed over the years. And it was a style that really challenged our perception. And that's, I think, probably the one beer in particular, Julius from Treehouse, that kind of inspired us to take this on and try this project. But we never really did a test batch. We kind of jumped right in, just like we've been doing even still, with a 15-barrel batch, and that was the batch we put on for our anniversary. So we really didn't have any expectation that this would be a style that we made a lot of, or that we would go on to make almost 50% of our production, or actually now more like 60 for New England style IPA. That was never our plan or our strategy. It just became this beer that had its own following, had its own kind of interest, and I think a lot of that was because we brought a perspective that was unique, just like Hot 13 with codename Superfan here in Colorado, Cerebral with Rare Trait, and Fiction with Logic is Relative, the kind of first beers of those New England style IPAs that were on the market. here in Colorado, they all brought something new. And so we knew even in Colorado, we wanted to have our own perspective on the style. So we focused a little bit more on balance, I guess. It was not nearly as bitter as a lot of the styles. That was intentional. We wanted to really push the bounds of hop character, but really push the lower limit of bitterness and what's acceptable bitterness for an IPA. That was probably the biggest feedback we got when we first started producing it, especially for people who had not tried other New England style IPAs, was just how low the bitterness was of Juicy Bits. We've maintained that same low bitterness. We don't really measure it much because there's a lot of reasons why the IBU test is not as valid as it was 10 years ago. But we're probably guessing in that 40 range. On sensory, it's coming back around that, around 40, 45 IBUs, sometimes lower. But for a beer that's 4 or 5 pounds of hops per barrel, that's a fairly low bitterness. And so that was part of our perspective. And then we also wanted to introduce a new varietal that I don't think was being utilized. So when we were talking about Juicy Bits and which hops to use, we knew for sure Citra was part of that. I think Citra might be the most utilized hop, not just in New England style IPAs, but in American IPAs today, and that's for good reason. It's just this amazing tangerine, tropical fruit, citrus varietal that is really, I think, pushing the boundaries for other varietals. That I think that was the first hop that really, I think, moved us past a lot of the pine focus and a lot of the resin and into this fruit and tropical fruit and citrus kind of focus we have now on varietals. And so Citra was, from day one, that was, okay, we know we want to use Citra. And then it was, okay, what hops can we complement Citra? And a hop that we had started playing with but not used a whole lot was Mosaic. It's obviously a huge hop that's been used in tons of IPAs, but maybe not quite as prevalent. Maybe now it's a bit different, but at the time, Citra was obviously king and Mosaic was kind of coming up behind it. And so playing with Mosaic, we started getting this incredible pineapple character, this ripe pineapple juice flavor. So much so that we have a lot of people that assume we add fruit juice to Juicy Bits, which I can guarantee you we do not. There's no fruit in Juicy Bits. But between that tangerine, almost candy tangerine character of Citra and this really nice pineapple, ripe pineapple from Mosaic, this really nice fruit balance. It's more fruit juice than you would expect for a beer that has no fruit in it. So we were looking for a third hop to kind of complement those two. And El Dorado was one that we had heard about and tried a few beers with, but never seemed to be utilized, I think, in necessarily the best ways. Some of them we'd had were great. Others kind of moved more in this really dank, oniony, garlic character that I think a lot of people associate with El Dorado. And I think a lot of that was just the way that it was utilized, whether it was on the hot side or when it's added to fermentation or even the rates. A single hop El Dorado beer is not something we've pursued. We may still produce one, but it seems like a great hop to complement. And so this was kind of our grounding hop. So still a lot of fruit character from El Dorado. And in fact, our hop selection this year out in Yakima, we selected lots that expressed a lot more mango and tangerine than we had seen in this past year's lot. So we're super excited for that lot to come up. But beyond just that fruit, there's also this really nice kind of herbal character, a little bit of dankness that I think really balances out the fruit character we get from Citra and Mosaic. Kind of brings in its own fruit, but together those three hops, they make up an even 1-to-1-to-1 ratio in Juicy Bits. And so that was, I think, where we focused most on Juicy Bits was hop selection for that beer and rates and figuring out when to add them. So in terms of bitterness, like I mentioned, we do not use any kettle hop additions in Juicy Bits. It's all whirlpool and dry hop, and it's we adjust the rates based on the hops that we're using. The crop year, obviously, new crop year coming up, we'll be dialing it in based on we're brewing to a target flavor, not to a target hop rate. So it's not like every single time we brew Juicy Bits it needs to be at 3.5, 4, 5 pounds per barrel. It's basically what hop rate do we need to produce the flavor that Juicy Bits is known for. So the flavor is consistent, and as long as that's the case, then we adjust the recipe accordingly. So that's, I think, where we focus. We want to make a beer that has a unique perspective, has a unique hop character, and maybe a little bit lower bitterness than the style's used to. And the result, I think, is this beer that transcended a lot of the IPA market. It was a beer that doesn't just appeal to IPA drinkers. Certainly the hopheads enjoy it for different reasons, maybe not for the bitterness, but for the hop character. But we have a lot of people that walk in and say, hey, I hate IPAs, what else do you have? And they'll try Juicy Bits and they don't even realize that that beer is an IPA. And I think that's, for us, we take that as a compliment. So people that normally would be completely turned off by an IPA seem to find Juicy Bits is something unique and something totally different than what they expect from my IPA. And so that beer is really, I think, what's catapulted our growth. Medi Noche's had a big impact in some of our GABF and World Beer Cup medals as well. But Juicy Bits, I would say, is the one SKU that has given us a platform to really focus on styles that we never thought we could produce here, especially with a market that originally we thought wanted something a little bit more price sensitive, a little bit maybe more affordable and perhaps approachable on certain aspects. And Juicy Bits now, I think, is for us still a grounding point. It's still our anchor for this style. We take a lot of other risks in other beers. Juicy Bits became kind of a recipe we couldn't tweak. We couldn't really make drastic changes because it became so popular. That flavor that we accomplished in just that very first batch or two is really what people wanted. And so we had to figure out ways to evolve other recipes and other ideas and learn more about the style without compromising what we had produced with Juicy Bits. So Juicy Bits has spawned a whole bunch of iterations and spin-offs. We introduced the Alpha Bits line shortly after Juicy Bits, which is what we called our hop playground and our hop proving ground. That 9 or so batch series culminated in a beer we produce with our contract brewery, Sleeping Giant in Denver, just now known as Alpha Bits. And it's it's kind of Juicy Bits brother or cousin, or I won't say older or younger brother, but it's in that Juicy Bits family, but it's a beer we produce for distribution. So we hop it actually at a higher rate, knowing that it's going to be on shelves a little bit longer than what we produce here in the tap room. We also focus more on the stability, so there's some things we adjusted, even using a centrifuge to get a better haze stability. We adjust a little bit on the protein, just some considerations that we had, knowing that beer will hit distribution versus Juicy Bits that may not hit a wide distribution footprint. And beyond Alpha Bits, we've also now done Beta Bits. We have a Fruity Bits line. We even do iterations of Juicy Bits, the double IPA version, extra Juicy Bits, and now since then extra Juicy Bits. So we're sort of beating a dead horse right now with our flagship, but it's really prompted us to move into different styles. So back to Juicy Bits and the recipe itself. We talked about the hops, when to add them. The malt is a big focus for us too. So we use almost an even amount now of Pilsen malt and pale malt. If you're using 2-row that might be lighter than the Northwest Pale we use from Great Western, you might be able to cut out the Pilsen and just use your 2-row, your base, standard US 2-row, American 2-row malt as your base. But we really want to focus on a lighter kind of malt mouthfeel and character, but still a lot of flavor. And it's kind of this really, really delicate balance that we try and strike with Juicy Bits. So that's kind of our base malt. But then the protein malts are where we focus on this, taking that mouthfeel to the next level with a bit more creaminess, a bit more full character, this really soft, kind of pillowy mouthfeel that the New England style IPAs are known for. And that's where we add flaked wheat, flaked oats, and white wheat malt. And we kind of shoot for a target of 20% total of high protein malts. We found that's the best for not only mouthfeel and balance, but also for haze stability. Below that, we weren't seeing enough kind of protein and hop interaction, this hop polyphenol and protein binding that gives us this better haze stability, which we're not brewing to an aesthetic, but there's certainly some flavor characteristics that we found, and even some hop characteristics. The brighter hop character does seem to have, does benefit from a better haze stability. And so that above 20% and below 20%, we kind of found it either too much haze or too much kind of turbidity, or not enough to give us that desired flavor and hop flavor. So 20% high protein malts is where we kind of target. And I mentioned briefly the water chemistry. We focus on 3-to-1 chloride to sulfate. So we're around 175 maybe even 200 parts of chloride to roughly 75 parts sulfate. Our total calcium is around 130. Since we started brewing Juicy Bits, we used calcium chloride and calcium sulfate to adjust our water chemistry, but we found our calcium levels were too high. So we started adjusting, we started using magnesium sulfate, Epsom salt, to adjust our sulfates and still maintained calcium chloride for that chloride addition. So what it did was bring our overall calcium levels down to a bit more manageable 100 to 120 level that doesn't trigger early flock in our yeast and also doesn't have a real effect on the finished kind of flavor. Too much calcium, we were seeing this almost chalkiness and just flavor that we didn't really love in the finished beer. So for brewers looking to adjust water chemistry, especially if you're pushing the limits on both chloride and sulfate, if you're using calcium chloride, calcium sulfate, maybe consider substituting magnesium sulfate as an alternative so your calcium levels stay within a reasonable amount. For yeast selection in Juicy Bits, we went with a pretty different strain than what we were used to using in our steam barrel IPA, or our West Coast IPA, which has now been discontinued. We were using Chico in that, the California ale strain for steam barrel. And so when we wanted to try and create this new IPA in Juicy Bits, we wanted something a little bit different and a little almost inverse of what we get with Cali. So we chose London Ale 3, the Boddington's, I think, BSI or Y Yeast or Omega Yeast or anybody that produces it. Usually London Ale 3, 1318, it goes by a lot of names, but it's a British ale strain that is a little bit lower attenuating than say Chico. It's lower flocculating than Chico, so you don't get as hard a flock. It's technically a true top cropping strain, which does present its own challenges that we'll talk about when we talk a little bit more about yeast. But also it is more expressive. There's more fruit character, there's more esters, and we really focus on that fruit character with Juicy Bits. So we ferment it a little warmer, we underpitch it a bit just to drive that ester production, a little bit of stress with that, so we do get some more expressive ester. And then we also really let it free rise pretty quickly on during fermentation to one, make sure it attenuates, but two, to really focus on that flavor development. 1318 is definitely a challenge to work with, and we kind of knew that we wanted to use this strain when we started working on Juicy Bits, but that made us focus a little bit on certain things such as mash temperature and even focusing on the malt and gravity and ABV. It seems like 1318 is extremely easy to dial into that 6.2% to 6.8% ABV range for an IPA, just because of its attenuation. So for Juicy Bits, we mash right at 149, kind of max attenuation for that strain. We push the gravity a little bit higher. We want the finishing gravity to be, manageable enough, not super bone dry, but still enough residual, sweetness to give it body and give it the balance for the hops. And so we mash 149, and we do make sure that beer attenuates as far as it can. We'll talk a little bit more about pale ales, double IPAs, and even fruited IPAs. But when you change that, when you change the gravity, when you change, your target ABV, you are going to see London Ale 3 is a little bit harder to dial in than say Cali, because attenuation does become a concern, and even just some of the flavor development. So mash temperatures, I think we've dialed that in at 149. We've played with 148, 150, 153, and we kind of landed on the sweet spot of 149 specifically for Juicy Bits. And attenuation, we're seeing anywhere from 72 to 75, percent attenuation ADF, and that's I think about the max of that strain. You'll see occasionally you can get it up to 76, but I believe the stated attenuation is around 70 to 75%. Other things that we kind of do different with Juicy Bits, everyone asks about turn times and how long does it take to produce and dry hop times. Juicy Bits is not a quick beer to produce. A lot of people assume because of the turbidity, because of the haziness, that we just rush it to package, rush it to market because you can cut out a lot of the conditioning stages to have this hazy beer, which is true. You could do that. It's obviously not going to produce the same beer, and in my mind, it'll produce an inferior beer. So conditioning times and total brew length and total turn time for Juicy Bits is close to 25 days. It's about the same length of time that we were producing our West Coast style IPA, which is still on the long side. Because of our high hop rates, we want to give it enough time after dry hopping to condition, to drop a lot of the kind of harsher vegetal hop character out. We don't want that really green, really almost bitter vegetal hop matter in suspension. We want to make sure that's all dropped. We also want to drop the yeast. So everyone assumes incorrectly that a hazy beer, a beer as turbid as Juicy Bits, has a lot of yeast in suspension. The reality is it has very, very little. Our Alpha Bits cans we produce with Sleeping Giant have 0 cells per milliliter of yeast in the final packaged beer. So even with a fairly moderate haze and turbidity in that beer, it has no yeast. Juicy Bits isn't quite that low because we don't have a centrifuge here, but we're seeing 50,000 cells per milliliter is the absolute max. We're seeing closer to 10 on a lot of our finished packaged kegs and crowlers and even cans of Juicy Bits. And so we want to drop that yeast because, one, it will add a different flavor, sometimes astringency, sometimes this kind of meatiness that you don't want in an IPA that's fruit forward and expressive and vibrant. That can kind of mute a lot of that character. And two, it really does have an impact long term on the stability of the beer, especially the haze stability. You'll see a lot more settling in cans or in crowlers or even in kegs for beers that haven't been conditioned long enough. That yeast eventually is going to drop, and it's going to bring with it protein and hop polyphenols. So the less yeast we have in the finished beer, the less the polyphenol and protein that kind of creates this stable haze, the less that drops. Which I think just creates this really vibrant IPA. That hop polyphenol, especially in suspension, is what I think gives that New England style IPA its really vibrant, bright aroma and this just really, really flavorful hop character. So we do condition it almost 4 to 5, sometimes 7 days after dry hopping is complete, just to get it to where we think it's conditioned long enough to package. And so it's not a beer if you're trying to turn it really quickly. There's definitely breweries that do, and they have other methods they can employ. We don't have a lot of the equipment here that we would be able to utilize to see quicker turns. So it's a beer that takes us 20 to 25 days on average to produce. And we haven't really done anything to change that. We've produced other beers in the New England style IPA category that we do turn a bit faster. But right now, Juicy Bits sees 3 different dry hop additions, 1 during very active fermentation, 3, 4 Plato before terminal, and then 2 after terminal. And we've just found that for Juicy Bits in particular, we get a lot of the hop character that we want, the flavor we want from that, biotransformation addition during dry hop or during fermentation, and then the post terminal gives us that bright kind of, what everyone expects from an American IPA. And so we get different flavor from all 3 of those additions, and we certainly are playing with how much we add at each addition, when to add them, and even how long to leave them. We're constantly evaluating that in our process. For a brewer that's looking to improve their IPAs, I think dry hopping and especially oxygen egress is the biggest area you can improve. So we're always cognizant of when we're dry hopping. The benefit of doing a dry hop during fermentation is that you're still scrubbing O2, you're still pushing out CO2, so you have a fairly low oxygen ingress rate versus post fermentation terminal additions. There's always a risk of every time you open that tank to add hops, you open it to potential exposure to oxygen. So we've been really, really working on making that as efficient a process as possible, and there's lots of other, whether it's using a pump, an Ampco unit, or even a dry hop unit to add hops in a closed system may very well be, or even cutting down to 1 dry hop addition at terminal and just a higher rate. Those are all things we're playing with, but for now, Juicy Bits is a 3 dry hop beer, and that's where it kind of leads to that 20 to 25 days of time. So if you're looking to get into brewing New England style IPAs, there's lots of resources out there. If you want to try and make your own version of Juicy Bits, we've published the recipe with Craft Beer and Brewing. You can find it online. And then their Hazy IPA, New England style IPA issue, the best of last year. There's also an article there kind of unlocking some of the secrets of New England style IPAs to go into more depth of kind of the topics we've been talking about. But that's certainly a good starting point for you if you want to try and see, that's just one perspective on how to make the style. Certainly don't take that as the only way to make it. There's plenty of other breweries making great versions, home brewers making great versions. There's lots of information on the internet that was not there when we started producing Juicy Bits. And so I definitely encourage you to research the style, understand what other breweries are doing. But if you want to start with Juicy Bits, that's a good starting point. But beyond that, once you get into the style, you kind of understand a little bit more about how it works and how it's different than brewing a traditional IPA. I think the best way that brewers can understand more about the process is designing your own recipe. So take some of those basics from Juicy Bits, whether it's malt, hops, yeast, water chemistry, and start crafting your own. With malts, try something maybe 100% Pilsen malt. Try something with a very, very soft, even softer malt profile than what we're using with either pale or two-row, and see what a 100% Pilsen malt might produce. And also with the protein malts, there's obviously flaked oats, flaked wheat, white wheat. There's plenty of other high protein malts that you can kind of experiment with. You can try exclusively using oats. Obviously wheat has a higher gluten content, so if you're looking for a beer that you might want to cut some of the gluten out, you could potentially try and just use oats, flaked oats in particular, or you could try just wheat. You could try a multitude of different protein malts, and there's always that chance that try something with no protein. Try a malt base that has no wheat, no oats, and just depends on the protein from the base malt. And try, we don't use any crystal or caramel malts, but that doesn't mean that they're not a good place for them in New England style IPAs. If you are using crystal malts for color or maybe even a little bit of flavor, I recommend kind of on the lower level bond, 40 or below probably. Munich is another great, kind of adding a little color, maybe a little bit of character. And then we use Carafoam for our kind of dextrin malt, but there's tons of others. There's Carapils, there's Dexter Pills. There's a lot of high dextrin malts that can give you some even added mouthfeel components that you might not get with oats or wheat. So try and play with even those. With the base malts themselves, you can try something like Maris Otter, Pearl, maybe some of the traditional British malts, kind of bring in a bit more of the British history of the style. I think a lot of the British IPA techniques and malt even and water could really, in the New England style IPA, kind of process could yield some really fun results. Beyond the malt, you could also try experimenting with hops and hop additions and hop rates. Citra, Mosaic, Dorado are great kind of candidates for New England style IPAs, but there are numerous experimental varietals and new varietals coming out all the time. There's Idaho 7, there's Azaka, obviously Amarillo, Simcoe, Enigma. There are plenty of varietals that are coming out almost annually from some of the best hop growers in the world, and I really encourage home brewers and professional brewers alike to try new hops that may not be as proven. Just because there's not as many beers being produced with hop like Enigma or some of these newer varietals doesn't mean that they don't have a place in this New England style IPA marketplace. In addition to the varietals themselves, there are different formats for the hops, whether it's pellets, Lupulin powder, even the cryo powder now in pellet form. There's lots of new advances in hop even processing that is yielding unique results that you may not have been able to achieve with just the pellets or whole flower alone. We're constantly evaluating new products that are hitting the market, whether it's even hop extracts. We've done some lupulin powder beers that have turned out just fantastic, different than what we've seen with pellets, but there's certainly some, I think, a lot of room for exploration and experimentation with just different packaging techniques and hops. And we'll see a lot more of that happening, especially as small brewers find ways to utilize these new products. And home brewers especially have an advantage over commercial brewers in that they can brew small batches and get access to maybe an ingredient or a varietal or even a format that we may not even have access to because we have demands of higher volume. So if you're looking to do just a 10-gallon batch, a 5-gallon batch of something with lupulin powder, It's a great way to experiment with some different ways to integrate those hops. And at the same time, experiment with different additions. Experiment with when to add the hops during dry hop. Try a beer that you knock out and rack onto hops in the fermenter. We know a few breweries that are doing that with great success. Obviously, their rates are much higher to, you're going to scrub some of the flavor and even character out with the CO2 produced during fermentation, but you'll also get this amazing biotransformation that you may not be able to accomplish even in a mid or late fermentation dry hop addition. Try adding hops, exclusively in the dry hop and no whirlpool. There's some really exciting studies now. The 0 IBU IPA, no isomerized alpha acids. We're seeing now that you can actually contribute bitterness. Oxidized alpha acids, humulinones are contributing a stable bitterness to beer. We're seeing that you can increase the bitterness of your beer or even lower the isomerized alpha acids. You can lower that with dry hop rates. So there's some great papers and studies being done right now just about these beers at 2 to 3 pounds or more of dry hops. So try a 0 IBU IPA. I can tell you sensory and even on some tests that they will not actually be 0 IBUs, but it's a fun experiment to see what kind of bitterness and flavor can you get from just dry hopping. There's obviously some other concerns with whether it's boil overs or even some stability, but as a home brewer, that's an awesome way to just really understand what dry hopping contributes to your beer. We've started talking here at WeldWerks about doing some 0 IBU tests, and we'll be working with some other breweries, specifically New Belgium, for a seminar we're doing up at Big Beers in January in Breckenridge to really focus on this 0 IBU and dry hop, excessive dry hopping. What does that contribute to beer, and trying to challenge our perceptions of bitterness. And we publish numbers that maybe are not as valid as they were, and so we're really trying to get a better metric and a better understanding of what bitterness means, especially when it relates to what is contributed by isomerized alpha acids and now oxidized alpha acids. Beyond hops, there's yeast that you can experiment with. Obviously, we use 1318 and London Ale 3 here at WeldWerks for almost all of our New England style IPAs, but Conan, Dry English, maybe even try some variety or some strains that may not be known for IPA production. I know I've heard mention of a brewery that's using a German strain or a Belgian strain with the focus being on esters over phenolics. There's obviously ways you can manipulate any fermentation to favor the flavors that you're trying to get out of that beer. So try a Hefeweizen strain fermented with expressive ester production in mind and maybe not as much phenolic. Try American strains. Try a Cali strain, seeing what you can get out of Cali. Obviously, flocculation is going to be different in attenuation, but especially the ester production. Cali will produce a lot of esters in certain environments. So if you're looking for an ester forward strain, try some strains that may not be as well known for this style in particular. So beyond malt, hops, and yeast, there's obviously water, and water chemistry for a home brewer can be a little bit harder to dial in. You may not have access to testing that commercial breweries have. You may not have as much equipment to start with a more neutral water profile. We're very fortunate in Greeley. We have some of the best water in the world coming from northern Colorado. It's a really great base to almost build any recipe around. But if you have a lot harder or a lot softer water, or if you have a lot of minerality that you may not want, or chlorine or chloramine, you may have to use filters. You may have to use RO. You may have to use something else to start with a neutral water profile and build from there. That doesn't mean you can't build an awesome water profile to produce a great New England style IPA. It also means you can accentuate different things. We focus more on chloride than sulfate, but that doesn't mean that you couldn't focus on both equally, or maybe even more sulfate if you're trying to push bitterness a little bit more in the style than is typical. There's certainly ways to experiment with all those additions. Chloride and sulfate kind of interactions, I think, have a big impact on the finished beer. But you could just try exclusive additions of chloride, exclusive additions of sulfate, and see what those experiments, what results they yield. And then beyond just that, there's even some considerations for minerality and what your base minerality is, whether it's calcium. You need to be cognizant of magnesium. But as a home brewer, use the water you have available to you and highlight things from there. You may have to start with some sort of test. You could probably get a water report from your local municipality. Some of these tests are not super expensive for basic ion tests. You could probably for $40 maybe get a full workup of your water. The most useful data will be your actual brewing water. So obviously water fluctuates from season to season, but if you could test from your source or wherever you're getting your brewing water from, if you could have that tested, that would give you the best kind of starting point for how to build your water profiles. So we talked a lot about Juicy Bits and New England style IPA being kind of that single IPA, 6 to 7% roughly, but there are a lot of opportunities to experiment with the New England style beyond just IPAs. Pale ales, double IPAs, fruited IPAs, they all kind of have this the same approach to them that the New England style IPA has, but there's different considerations to keep in mind if you're going to tackle those other styles. So we'll start with New England style pale ales. When brewing a New England style pale ale, let's say in the 5%, maybe a little lower, up to 5.5% ABV. It's obviously you're taking a lot of what you focus on with New England style IPAs, lower bitterness, higher kind of hop character and flavor and aroma, balanced malt, a little bit more mouthfeel, expressive yeast fermentations, all these things that make it unique. You're keeping those, but you're also focusing on what makes American style pale ale unique from American IPA. So you're seeing not just lower ABV, you're probably seeing a little bit more balance, a little bit less just over the top hop character, certainly less bitterness, and maybe a touch more approachability, a little bit more drinkability. So bitterness in particular, you're going to want to even dial back a little bit more from your typical New England style IPA because you're going to be working with a little bit less malt backbone to support that. So you may decrease your hop rates across not just your whirlpool additions, but your dry hop additions as well in order to maintain balance. Attenuation is a big factor. You're obviously going to attenuate if you're using the same strain as your IPA. You'll need to consider where you want to finish. If you want to finish a bit drier than your typical, New England style IPA, which is acceptable for pale ales, you may not need to make too many adjustments. But if you're trying to maintain this really soft, pillowy mouthfeel with a lot of body, you'll probably need to adjust your mash temperatures, especially. Mash a little bit on the warmer side to lower your finish, or to raise your finish gravity and keep the beer from over attenuating. The other factor to consider when you're making a New England style pale ale is that the malt itself is going to be a bit more, I think, delicate. You're not going to have as much room with the alcohol sweetness. You're going to want to really dial in that malt backbone. So maybe consider a lighter malt, maybe Pilsen focused instead of pale or even two-row or even some of the other specialty malts. And you also may not need as much protein. 20% protein malt, high protein malt in a pale ale might overwhelm the body a bit, so maybe try 10 to 15%. So just a couple of things to tweak if you're trying to tackle the New England style pale ale. Things that are unique to that style is that you can have a bit more balance, you can have a bit more approachability and drinkability, and a little bit more sessionability. So something you could drink maybe 2 or 3 of instead of just this 16 ounce to maybe 2 pints of a big kind of bolder New England style IPA. It's a style that I think New England style pale ale in particular, I don't think it's a style that's really been utilized a whole lot. I don't think a lot of breweries that are making IPAs are also doing a pale ale. We started doing a few more at WeldWerks, and we're really liking the difference in drinkability and the way that you can enjoy more of those without necessarily the same palate fatigue or even the ABV contribution. It's just a different approach, but same ethos as the New England style IPA. For New England style double IPAs, it's almost the opposite considerations from pale ales. We're still keeping that same kind of core value of New England style IPA, and we're just taking the alcohol to the next step, the hops to the next step, and even the body to the next step. But it does make attenuation a real challenge. We're always, with Juicy Bits, we're always on the top end of attenuation for London Ale 3. So what we've done to maintain balance and avoid going too sweet and too kind of cloying on the finish gravity of our double IPAs, we'll add dextrose to help dry it out, even honey. Something extremely fermentable will maintain that 149 mash temperature to maximize our attenuation. We may even ramp up our fermentation temperatures a little earlier on to just ensure full attenuation of that double IPA. But dextrose and highly fermentable sugar is a great way to really encourage that full attenuation so that you don't end up with a beer that's too malty, too sweet, and out of balance. But obviously you are going to finish a little bit higher. You're going to have more body, you're going to have a little bit more alcohol, and so you're going to need to balance that with more hops. So our double IPAs, our New England style double IPAs, start around 6 pounds per barrel total on hops, and they quickly get into the absurd range of 10 to 12 pounds per barrel. That's a bit excessive and not necessarily something that we do often, but we do see a difference. Extra juicy bits being the prime example. That beer is unique in that it's dry hopped excessively. The dry hop edition alone is almost 7 pounds per barrel, 7 to 8 pounds per barrel total, and it's dry hopped for an extended period of time. It also conditions for an extended period of time. But even if you're doing that 5 to 7 pound per barrel range of double IPA brewing in the New England style IPA or double IPA, you'll want to make sure that that beer has enough conditioning time. With those excessive hop rates, it's easy to end up with a lot more vegetal, a lot more kind of grassy notes in the finished beer. So it may take even longer. Extra juicy bits for us is close to a 28-day turn, maybe as long as 30 days, depending on how long it takes to condition. So that's a big factor when adding more hops and more body, all these things. It just may take a lot more time to condition and kind of round out all the edges and get this really kind of beautiful balance between malts, hops, bitterness, ABV, and mouthfeel. And then beyond that, there's obviously fruited IPAs and adjunct IPAs. We really took a lot of inspiration from Tired Hands and the Milkshake series, which obviously started as kind of this, a little bit of kind of a tongue-in-cheek beer and turned out to be pretty fantastic. We've had a few of them, and I think they really were the first ones that I know of that pushed the boundaries on fruit and kind of wild adjuncts in a New England style IPA or double IPA base. So that beer kind of inspired us to launch our own fruited IPA series we call Fruity Bits. It started kind of as just this, okay, what if we add fruit to the Juicy Bits base? And then we kind of changed focus a little bit and made it this more intentional product and this more intentional approach to brewing the whatever IPA we wanted to produce. So when we brew with mango, we focus on more mango forward hops. We might push the El Dorado character a bit more. We may push the Amarillo character a little bit more. When we do pineapple, such as Fruity Bits Pina Colada, we push the Mosaic character a lot further. We focus almost exclusively on Mosaic to get that kind of pineapple character to complement the real pineapple puree, pineapple concentrate, sometimes whole pineapple or whole fruit that we add to these IPAs. So we take a really intentional approach to what can the hops and fruit accomplish that the hops alone and the fruit alone couldn't separately. And so I think that's what we get excited about when we talk about fruited IPAs and Fruity Bits in particular, is creating this flavor experience that's really intentional in the way it's designed, but really challenging what a lot of people assume about fruited IPAs or even hops in general. So we've done several iterations of this series, Fruity Bits, and the most popular by far is Fruity Bits Pina Colada. And that was born out of this idea of, okay, beyond just this pineapple, what if we took a daiquiri approach? What if we took, this quintessential tropical island drink, huge pineapple, huge coconut, and brought it into an IPA? And so we started adding coconut to our pineapple Mosaic, from New England style IPA, and that's kind of where Pina Colada was born. So it's a little bit of this tropical, summer experience. We brew it beyond just summer because people seem to want an island escape even in the middle of winter. So Fruity Bits Pina Colada was kind of a beer that turned a corner for us as well, where we said, okay, rather than just the fruit and the hops, what if we start bringing in adjuncts? And milkshake, the Milkshake series from Tired Hands certainly started that with some vanilla and lactose additions. So we've done some fruited IPAs with lactose as well. Fruity Bits Pina Colada is now, we did some test batches with lactose. We kind of brought the lactose back and forth, and now we've kind of pulled it out just because we get so much creaminess from the coconut. We don't really need any lactose, but we've done, a peaches and cream. We've done a strawberry shortcake. We've done a lemon meringue. We've done these fruited IPAs with vanilla beans, with lactose, to kind of recreate these, what you would almost expect in a pastry stout, or this pastry beer. We're kind of bringing some of that into our IPA brewing with the fruited New England style IPAs. So, beyond just your New England style IPA, there's a lot of room for experimentation with adjuncts with fruit. And my advice has always been, whether it's pastry stouts or adjunct IPAs, is intentionality. Just throwing lactose into an IPA without considering how that'll impact the final flavor will probably not yield the best results. So when you do make those changes, when you add lactose to an IPA, consider the fact that it's going to have a lot more residual sugar. So maybe push the attenuation even further than you normally would to still maintain balance. It'll give it a different kind of creaminess than you get with high protein malts, but it can also go to too sweet, too cloying if you're not cognizant of that kind of additional ingredient. Same with the fruit. We add fruit during fermentation to ensure we attenuate the majority of the fruit, especially the high sugar fruit that we add. But that does mean we need to consider that we may dry out the beer if we're just using fruit alone. We may over attenuate the beer just because of this huge fructose, highly fermentable addition. We still get the fruit kind of lingering in the final beer even after it's fully attenuated, but we may dry out the beer beyond where we plan. And acidity and pH is another consideration. Fruit additions, depending on what fruit, some of them have a huge impact on pH, some of them not so much. So you need to consider that for the health of your fermentation, and also in the finished beer, that acidity may interact with the hops in a different way. It may interact with the mouthfeel and the malt. So all those considerations, when you're kind of playing with adjuncts and fruit, just make sure you're intentional in the way you design your recipe and intentional in the final product you're trying to produce. The best kind of advice when formulating a recipe is try just one variable at a time. Try and focus on making one change from batch 1 to batch 2, or from one recipe to the next, rather than changing every variable. You'll get a better understanding of what that change, the impact it had on your finished beer. You'll also have a better understanding of future development, how to move beer in certain directions. It's always kind of moving the pendulum one direction or the other. It's not this bullseye we're trying to hit, it's just kind of this moving target that you're always kind of shifting your approach to hit. And so, water, yeast, hops, malts, those are all great ways that you can dial in this recipe and make it your own. But experiment beyond that, and experiment beyond just this style that doesn't really have its own guideline yet. Focus on what you want to do with the style, whether it's focusing on fruit forward hops, balance, mouthfeel. Make it your own.